Is Russia making progress against the key outskirts of Bakhmut in Soledar, or are they just throwing more troops into a meat grinder? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is December 11th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first off, when we look at the territory map, there has been some minor changes to assessed control. First, a small advance by Russian forces, again to the outskirts of Bakhmut. As we've talked about, it's really the difficulty of advancing to the city, especially when Ukrainian forces control all of these urban buildings, make it really difficult for Russian forces to advance. It's just hard to dislodge someone from an urban area. And this advance kind of shows it, that while they've gained territory, the largest concentration of buildings, it looks like their forces are being kept on the west side of this river here. The other interesting and noteworthy development is this town of Yakovlivka has also been assessed as fully Russian controlled. But as you can see, the tactical objective is the seizure of Soledar, which itself is incidental to the overall operational goal of taking Bakhmut. But they're a long way from being able to do this. And you can see that seizing this small town is not really bringing them any closer, because this doesn't really open the door to Soledar, just because of the vast empty distances they would have to cross in order to seize any of the actual town itself. Now, it could be used as, say, a fire base, but even that, you're better off just simply trying to finish your control of Bakhmutsky and use that as your fire base, your indirect fire staging area. So not the end of the world. As we discussed, I think Russian advances are not misaligned with ultimately Ukraine's strategy, which is to punish the Russians for trying to take Bakhmut and make this entire front line become a grind. And when we look at the recent attacks, we can see that I think Russia is trying to stay the course in its strategy. You can see here is the advance we just looked at, where they are attempting to reach the outskirts of Bakhmut itself. Again, you can see just how dug in a lot of these Ukrainian forces are, and you can tell simply because of how strong these defensive lines can be. You can see here that the line of control is assessed slightly differently. Right here is that river, and it says that there was an attack, but it doesn't necessarily have this region as changing hands yet. But we can also look to the north, and we can see, as we talked about too, the Russians are also trying to get through Ukrainian defensive lines here near this wooded area, again, enjoying not much in the line of success. When we look to the north, you can see, again, they are, in fact, listening, right? This doesn't have Yakovlivka as being controlled by Russian forces, but it does show them doing what we talked about, which is trying to push into Soledar through Bakhmutsky. You can see there's just a lot more infrastructure, a lot more cover and concealment that will allow them to sort of leapfrog into Soledar, which again is, as you can see from the map, is essential to controlling the flow of traffic into and out of Bakhmut. Now, some other interesting news. First off, going over to ground news, right? The best source of information given the high levels of disinformation in this conflict. They help us see the bias and promote transparency in news. And I've got a link to try it for free down in the description. But the Russians have basically, there's some evidence that the Russians may have thought that they were going to be staying in Kherson a bit longer. Kherson is still working to clear all of the traps and IEDs that have been left behind by Russian forces. One example is a hand grenade in the detergent tray of a washing machine, a street sign sending passersby into a minefield, a police station, that is so booby-trapped that demining crews can't even start the hunt for evidence. All this says to me is that perhaps the Russians were planning on staying and fighting in Kherson. Generally, this sort of traps are characteristic of when you want to slow the advance of an enemy. though it's also possible, and we talked about this, that they didn't expect these traps to go off, but to stall the Ukrainian armed forces as they slowly had to scan and unwind all of these traps in Kherson, preventing them from quickly pursuing the Russians as they crossed the Dnipro River. I think that's probably the case. The final thing I want to point out, just to, gloat a little bit. First off, first to pat myself on the back, I talked a lot about how the Donetsk city, how embarrassing it was that the capital of the independent Republic of Donetsk was under a constant attack, constant shelling. And as you guys can see, the mill blogger in the Russian information space who has become increasingly critical. This is Igor Girkin, who served briefly with the DNR and was actually a former defense minister of the DNR. And fought in the 2014 separatist conflict, has been criticizing Putin, which is unusual given that this is a super pro-Putin guy, for failing to push Ukrainian forces near Donetsk city out of artillery range. And because Putin's identified the protection of Donbas civilians as one of the objectives of the Russian special military operation. And right, he's criticizing Putin for saying the progress of the military operation has been stable, and stating that only Putin and the Russian MOD actually see this war as successful. And we've talked about this. It is politically, right? War is always a political animal. Don't fool yourself into thinking that there is some sort of pure war. No such thing has ever existed. And the truth is that if you want to have an independent republic, like we've talked about, its capital city can't be under constant shelling, which Donetsk city is. And there's been really little progress made in terms of Russian forces' ability to actually get the Ukrainians to have some standoff. You can see as we work back through to last month, territory changes have been absolutely minimal. And this entire time, Donetsk city has been just getting hammered. They have no airport. Or at least they don't control the airport. They don't control large portions of their suburbs, and critically, they just can't protect their civilians from Ukrainian shelling. It also doesn't help that they've put their military headquarters in the city, making it a legitimate military target. All of that to say, this is why we see the incredible dispersion of Russian armed forces attacks, right? Because they're trying to serve so many different objectives that every political actor has their own ideas of what is essential. And you can see that here's, of course, Donetsk city hasn't really seen any major offensive operations in the last 24 hours. Instead, this whole region has. But if you're the DNR and an independent command, you're furious. This is what you're fighting for. And if you're a Wagner Group mercenary, you're fighting for Bakhmut. You're asking, what is the Russian Ministry of Defense doing up here? And all of these sort of conflicts about where to best allocate the forces, Russia seems to be solving by just dispersing their forces and never really achieving the concentrations necessary to achieve actual strategic gains. And the bureaucratic momentum is so strong that despite the fact that Bakhmut is pretty clearly a trap for Russian forces, they're still pushing into it simply because changing strategies requires, it's like changing a battleship, right? If the rudder's broken, it's going to keep going in the same direction, all other things being equal. But you have to have a functioning rudder to turn the battleship. And I'm not convinced that the Russian bureaucracy actually has enough control over this war to turn the battleship and actually draw the conclusion that Bakhmut is probably just a trap and that Russian forces would be better off trying to seize territory literally anywhere else. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Of course, if you want access to the combat video breakdowns that are too intense for YouTube, and trust me, YouTube just age restricted one of my videos. So, if I thought I knew what the rules were, I guess I still don't. But I can put up whatever I want on the Patreon. Thanks to my lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who really make this possible. Link is in the description. I'll see you all in the next one.